Leah is going to talk to us about sharing our faith in a secular culture. And I want to read just one little passage that she has published on the web. She says, "It isn't my job to explain the whole church and every bit of theology, or to trace out what Christianity says about every question that might come up today. A lot of what I try to do, and these now are my words, and I think what we should all try to do, a lot of what I try to do is to give a sense of why I find the church beautiful and plausible, enough to be worth asking questions about." Ladies and gentlemen, it gives me great pleasure to ask Leah to come to the podium and address us on sharing our faith in a secular culture. Leah.
Well, hello. Thank you all again for having me. I shared my story with you yesterday, and I kind of want to give advice I found useful about how to share the story of your own faith, or even questions about your own faith with people who don't share it. I titled this talk about just sharing your faith in a secular culture, but I think a lot of the time what we find we're doing is arguing about our faith, in a secular culture. It doesn't feel like an act of sharing. And what I'd like to do is kind of give a little advice I found helpful for bringing a conversation back to the place where sharing is relevant rather than fighting or yelling or debating. Because I think a lot of the time what we think we're going to do when we open a conversation about Catholicism, or about our own faith or our own journey, is we're kind of setting the stage for an argument. Because the one thing we know at the beginning of the discussion is that we disagree. And what we've all had a lot of practice witnessing is, disagreements that look like fights. Whether they're political disagreements that we watch on TV with two talking heads yelling at each other the whole time, or maybe the disagreement that happens between two particularly fractious family members at, the dinner table at holidays. That everyone has a lot of bad models of fights that it's almost easy to slip back into, or for your opponent to expect that you're about to launch into. So people get defensive right at the beginning of a disagreement. Because most disagreements they've seen have been kind of questions of dominance, of how will I meet this person and just beat them over the head with the truth until they say, "Gosh, I'm sorry, you were right and I was wrong, and also you're better than me." No one wants a discussion to end that way, but we're used to seeing them conducted as though that's the destination. So the framework I like to think about having my disagreements in isn't a framework of argument or debate or bludgeoning. I drift into all of those some of the time. What I try and come back to is thinking about my arguments and the way I approach them being framed as a question of hospitality. That what I really need to cultivate in a disagreement is a sense of hospitality. And why a sense of hospitality? Well, for one thing, I need to make a nice, comfortable home for the person I'm disagreeing with, or they aren't going to stay there and talk to me. The thing we forget sometimes in disagreements, and I forget it sometimes while I'm in them, is that no one's obligated to stay there and be disagreed with. I sometimes am just on the internet, on my blog or anywhere else, engage in kind of a little comments back and forth in an argument. I think, I can't leave, If I leave, everyone will know I stopped talking to this angry person on the internet who's been using all caps for the last 5 messages. And it just feels like leaving isn't an option. But it's always an option to walk away from a fight. And it's important to remember once you start, a disagreement or even a conversation that's based around a disagreement, that your opponent can walk away. They're not a coward for walking away. They're not a bad friend for walking away. They're not a bad arguer or a bad seeker of truth for walking away. So it's my job to make it pleasant for them to stay, which means my first task is hospitality. I'm going to talk about kind of 3 areas in which you can cultivate hospitality in a disagreement. 1, the purely logistical. 2 is kind of the way you approach the whole scope of the argument, how you decide how to arrange your arguments. And then the third is going to be when you actually get to the point where you're sharing your faith, how do you do that? So first, logistically, I found that it's really helpful to just go, am I being a good host, logistically, when I'm in the middle of a disagreement? I once had, about a year ago exactly, I had written an article about this controversial firing of this employee, long story, and what wound up happening on my Facebook page among my friends, so this isn't even internet strangers, so among my friends was kind of a rat-a-tat-tat, you're wrong, no, you're wrong, no, this person's stupid, and so I'd be starting to write a response to one person, and by the time I'd finished typing, there had been 4 other responses. And that feels normal on the internet, but it's a crazy way to have a disagreement. If it had been happening in my living room, I would have quite justifiably spoken up and said, hey, you're all talking over each other. Several of you are being very rude, and you can't behave that way in my house. But it's reasonable to behave that way on the internet. And I didn't have a way to kind of stop everyone right there. So what I did is I made them move the disagreement to my house. Because I couldn't be a good host online. So I just said, gosh, everyone, it sounds like we all disagree. You all live in DC with me. And if you just stop talking now, I will make you cookies at my house. And we can still fight then, I promise. I trust that you'll all disagree in 2 weekends, and you'll have cookies. Like, doesn't that sound nice? And I just moved the whole scope of the argument into a place where it was more pleasant to disagree, and where we had the benefit of seeing each other. So instead of just kind of a static profile picture, of seeing each other's faces change as a disagreement happened, of not really having the option to just yell over someone else because all the text would show up eventually. And I'll admit, I was a little sneaky in the way I set it up. I made sure I wasn't done with the cookies when everyone arrived. Sometimes I'm just late when I'm hosting, but this time it was strategic. So that as everyone arrived, I could say, oh gosh, my hands are full. You know, I'm still in the kitchen, these are in the oven. Could you two, who I remember had disagreed, could you two set out the plates, and could you get the milk? Could you two help move the couch? So that everyone had to work together with people they disagreed with before they even started the conversation. And before we even sat down, you know, people were passing each other napkins and handing over nice warm cookies. And you know, it took a lot of maneuvering to get to that place, but it's a much more natural place to have a disagreement. So I've tried to stay alert since then to when, by happenstance, I've wound up in a very inhospitable place. And to remember, I have the option to change it. That arguments on the internet, arguments where you're just yelling, arguments with a stranger are unnatural arguments, and I want to move them to a place of hospitality. And a lot of the time that's in my power to do, to just say, gosh, I can't keep having this argument right now this second. Would you mind if I made you dinner? Would you mind if I made you cookies? Would you mind, you know, just coming over to my house, you know, and we'll just sit, you know, on my porch? To move it to a place where we're already in an environment where we've shared love or shared fellowship. Which sounds like manipulation, but it's really restoring our actual relationship and putting that at the front of our disagreement. So I think it's nice to take an opportunity to go, how can I be a host during this fight? And if neither of you is a host when you're starting out, well, how can I flip that? How can one of us take responsibility for showing love for the other? Because until you do that, it's kind of as unproductive to have the disagreement as it would be if one of you were speaking French the whole way through. It's just harder to hear each other. So restoring their natural relationship and inviting someone into your home or inviting them to a neutral ground, maybe if it's someone you don't know so well and don't want in your living room first time, you know, even to a coffee shop so you're sharing food together and start on a more human-to-human interaction. Once I actually get to a better spot, one way I like to think about being hospitable is just even in the way I'm framing my arguments. Because a lot of the time it's tempting, and I have a debate background, so it's very tempting to kind of bludgeon someone with arguments. You know, someone who's a good debater can make a plausible case for anything. You know, and so that if the other person isn't as skilled rhetorically, they'll kind of feel like they have to knuckle under a little, even if your argument is untrue. And if I'm doing that, I'm a terrible host. I'm not giving them an argument that's actually aligned with truth. It's as bad kind of using just rhetoric as it would be if I were just yelling, or if I were saying, you can't have any cookies until you agree with me. You know, I remember that part Leah said about the cookies, but I figured out a new way to use them. because it's not kind. It's not what I would want someone to do if they received me into their house and were trying to persuade me of something they thought was important and true that I was missing. So kind of the second virtue of hospitality, the first is just choosing a good location and a good setting where you do remember that you like each other. And the second is kind of keeping always in my mind a sense of symmetry. That whatever I'm doing in this disagreement, however I frame my arguments, however I even interrupt, I want to behave the exact same way I want my opponent to behave towards me, even if I'm right, right? I have to almost conduct, and it's hard for me. I really can't get up to doing the virtue of symmetry from, zero to symmetry. I have to pause and go, nope, I'm going to pretend that I were wrong in this disagreement, even though I'm not, and then go, how would I need to conduct this disagreement so that I would have a chance to lose? What would I need to do so that it was possible for the other person to convince me? Because that's how I should behave towards them, and how I should be modeling them to behave towards me. And that means even sometimes when I am totally right, and it'd be totally fine for me to interrupt them because I happen to be right, and go, no, you're completely wrong, listen to me. I can't do it, because if they do it back to me and they're wrong, it's going to kind of take us off the path of moving towards truth. I have to do things that would work even if I were wrong, and would wind up with both of us moving together towards the truth. In the same way that when you're a host, you have to welcome people into your house as the way you'd want to be welcomed into theirs. You can't make up kind of wacky rules for your own house, or in my house we all sit on spikes. But it's my house, it's very nice. You welcome people as they are. I need to argue with people as they are so that even if I'm right, I'm conducting myself in the same way I want them to conduct themselves. So we have this symmetry, which again, kind of pushes me back towards this idea that we're already in fellowship. We're in disagreement, and that's one small facet of our relationship, this one disagreement, but what we really are is in fellowship. So everything else in the argument besides the point on which we disagree should look like fellowship. We should be talking to each other nicely. We should be in a place that's comfortable. We should both be conducting each other to give the other person a chance to change their mind and to give ourselves a chance to change our mind. I might be biased on that last fact because my changing my mind was really important to me, and I'm glad that I had arguments that made it easier for me to change my mind about Catholicism. But that means every time I have a new one, I want it to be as easy for my opponent. And some of that, making it easy for someone to change their mind, is just kind of not putting too much pressure on them even in one conversation, right? You want it to be easy for someone to go, oh, that's a good point, I hadn't thought about that, and not follow it with a, well, then you concede, don't you? You can't say, oh, that's a good point, if it's always going to be followed with kind of a rap across the knuckles of, well, you were wrong about that, wrong about everything, aren't you? Right? And I wouldn't want someone to treat me that way. So I have to keep pausing, even when it feels like I can kind of go for the killing blow in the debate, and go, nope. I want it to be easy for someone to come back. I want it to feel natural for them to continue this conversation. And, when I actually finally, in one way I even do that, is I want every fight to feel kind of low stakes. I want it to be, for either of us, again, going back to symmetry, a gradual accumulation of evidence and lived experience and kind of pausing to go back home and think about things that convinces someone, not that in one discussion I try and close the deal. Because no one can advance that many arguments that are that compelling in maybe a 20-minute disagreement. Even if I get someone to concede and I feel like I've won, they'll go home and they'll think about it, and they might, change their mind as they mull it over. And if I've kind of been inhospitable, even while forcing that concession, they won't come back to me with their questions later. So a lot of times what I like to do is almost force an artificial time limit on my disagreements and go, oh gosh, we were arguing so much the other day. I'd love to have coffee with you and argue with you again. But I'm pretty busy. So I have 40 minutes on Wednesday. Do you have time to have part of an argument? And saying part of an argument means, first of all, my opponent does not need to be worried that they're going to come over to my house and be kind of trapped there for the evening, maybe even the weekend, maybe we'll start having a disagreement and I'll go, oh, wow, this is a great disagreement. I can see you're really wrong. I can pull out the couch, You can just stay here at my house until you concede. It's hard to figure out how to exit an argument. I want it to be easy. I want it to be low stress. So outside my house where it's easy to leave, maybe, and 40 minutes. what if I disagree with my friend on, whether or not there's a God? We're not going to settle that in 40 minutes. No one's afraid that I'm going to kind of trap them there and say, you have to agree with me in 40 minutes. And they know that even if it goes badly, they get to leave. Even if I turn out to be doing this very badly and I don't take my own advice, and I don't always do as well in the heat of a moment as I do at a lectern, in 40 minutes they can go. And it makes it easier to turn up or to accept my invitation in the first place. So I want things to be pleasant and light and welcoming. And sometimes welcoming just means taking the pressure off. There's actually an interesting thing in terms of trying to have these fights in serial almost, right? Where, we have a 40-minute coffee fight, and then later maybe we have a 1-hour dinner argument, and then later a 15-minute ice cream kerfuffle. I don't know. It becomes part of our life going on as we add books or add an article. Oh, did you see? And it becomes an ongoing conversation where people might move a little over time. No one's kind of forcing a conversion in 1 minute. And it becomes easy to kind of come back to the discussion and share new things and share new questions. And what it reminds me of when it works well is something that David Graebener writes about in his big book, Debt. And I even forget how many thousands of years, but it's like debt, the first 3,000, 4,000 years. And it's his history of how we've understood debt. And one thing he says is that there's a culture that does a lot of barter. And when people pay each other back, they don't pay each other back exactly. If I borrow 6 chickens from you, you later turn up with 4 heads of broccoli, and it's about right, but you never kind of pay someone back exactly the right amount. And he said the reason you never pay someone back exactly the right amount is because it would be incredibly insulting. It would be, oh, I realized how much I owe you, so I've paid you back exactly. So now we don't need to have anything else to do with each other. We're done. I owe you nothing, you owe me nothing, we're finished. But when you always kind of owe each other a little, oh, I paid you back in broccoli, I probably owe you like 1 extra stalk of broccoli, so next time I have something, I'll come by. There's always an expectation there's a next time, an expectation of welcoming and a continuing relationship. And when your disagreements aren't kind of, let's settle this now, but, oh, I'd love to talk to you about this. I'd love for you to come back with questions. Oh, I just saw this article that reminded me of the disagreement we had a month ago. Maybe you want to look. It's almost like that kind of barter system where each of you bring ideas to the table. No one is ever satisfied. And there's an expectation you want to keep talking to each other. Now, sometimes what happens is, I'm talking to people about this beautiful idea of serial discussions, and people say, well, look, I can't have a serial discussion with this person. I met them on the train once. I met them in a comment thread on the internet. I met them, on the street. We saw each other, we locked eyes, it was disagreement at first sight. And I knew that we could have a beautiful 1-hour disagreement. And maybe you can have a beautiful thing right then. I would expect all those kind of glancing arguments to be less effective for both of you, because you don't have an ongoing relationship where it's natural to bring questions back. Sometimes I've had friends who have had kind of initially glancing disagreements, and they were so hospitable that it did feel natural for someone they met on a train or in a comments thread to go email them, right, and say, oh, I read this thing and it reminded me of what you said. I'd love to talk to you about it again. But most of the time, that doesn't always happen. So my goal is to conduct myself so someone might come back, but to really just put less of my energy into glancing disagreements, even if they feel like they're the noisiest or most important or the ones that are happening on the internet. And put more into the relationships I already have, where I have the opportunity to be hospitable with someone, rather than take every wrong person on the internet and also on the street as my personal duty to have 1 5-minute disagreement with and hopefully wrap things up there. So when I take kind of hospitality as my guide, it not only changes the arguments I have, but it redirects me in terms of where I want to put my effort or my energy or my time in arguments. And so the way it starts to feel for me, and this is hard because I have trouble backing down from a fight because I like having them, and it always feels a little like cowardice. But it starts to move me in the direction where when I see a comment and I don't think it would be productive for me to respond, what I don't feel is, oh, I'm too cowardly to not respond, or I'm shortchanging this person by not responding. I feel like, wow, if I started a disagreement with that person today, I would wind up shortchanging them. I don't have the time or the connection to wind up inviting them over or to wind up having a deeper discussion. I could only have a surface level disagreement with them. And since that's all I can offer, I don't want to. I don't want to offer them that small thing. I want to find someone else I can offer a larger, more beautiful disagreement to, one that can become an ongoing friendship. And that's kind of been what's helped me a lot, especially since I do blogging, to redirect myself away from just, that person called me a name. I will go write them a paragraph about why that was wrong, to, oh yeah, this friend of mine said something, or this friend of a friend, or this person who I've seen say a lot of reasonable things, so I feel like I have a pre-existing connection with, and sometimes I do have those on the internet. So the thing that confused me, let me respond, calling back to the fact, oh, but I liked your other comments, so I'm confused that you said this, and I can talk about this relationship we already share. But if I'm not going to start a relationship, a one-night stand of a disagreement is kind of as bad as a sexual one. So it's making promises I can't keep. Now, when I actually get to the point where I've welcomed someone into my home, welcomed someone into a coffee shop, wherever it is, where I have this kind of ongoing pattern of disagreements, and it's beautiful, it's a friendship founded on not agreeing with each other, the best kind of friendship, but of both loving truth enough to keep meeting, then I actually get to the moment where I can think about how to share my faith and how to put it before someone. And the temptation is always, I think, to try and start by proving my faith. To go, well, have you gotten a load of St. Anselm's ontological argument for God? I have looked it up on Wikipedia this morning, and here are the steps, Or, even a proof that was convincing to you. And again, that kind of often fails the welcoming test. It's not the question that my friend is most interested in. It's much more of a, let me see if I can get you to concede right this minute. And what I think about in terms of when I open with, once I've finally gotten to the point where we're in a good place, physically, emotionally, to have a disagreement, is this piece of advice people give writers. When you're starting a book, a short story, a novel, anything, of that the purpose of the first sentence of your book is to get people to read the second sentence of your book. The purpose of the second sentence is to read the third sentence. And you have to have something that causes someone, again, to want to stay here in this disagreement. They're never obligated to. I mean, sometimes when I bake, very good cookies, they're obligated to stay around and pretend to listen to me. But if I want them to actually be engaged in the argument for its own sake, I always need to be saying something that's actually interesting to them. And a sentence that starts with, I can prove why you're wrong, is only interesting to a very narrow subset of people. And they're mostly interested in listening for a flaw so they can go, that bit doesn't work. Now it's your turn to shut up, right? So a lot of times I like to open with not the thing that was most convincing to me truth-wise, especially because my own conversion story, as you guys all learned, is kind of this very complicated, nerdy, abstract thing. So sitting people down and going, let me start with deontology. Don't worry, I made lasagna, we can sit here all night, is not the best way to start. I want to start with something that is just beautiful or interesting or even weird, so that they'll stay for a moment and listen to what I'm saying. So for example, and in my book, which John was nice enough to hold up, Arriving at Amen, I talk a lot about analogies for things about the Catholic faith that I've found interesting, that kind of opened my way into it. So if I just start by talking about confession even, that's an interesting part of the faith. It's something that often is the one part that everyone feels makes a certain kind of sense even, so it feels like a natural door. Oh, do you ever know how you screw up? Because here's how Catholicism addresses that theologically. Because you're starting from a shared assumption. You know how sometimes you do bad things that you regret later? Ah, yes, that's something we both understand. But then I go, yes, and then the priest stands in persona Christi and forgives me, and the person starts to lose the thread of the discussion. I've jumped straight from the one thing we both know to theological language, and it's hard. So I want to, either frame it entirely in language and experiences that make sense to my friend, or at least move off of the native language of my faith to something that's perplexing enough to keep them there and asking questions. I don't need someone to understand what I say on the first pass. I need them to be interested enough in what I said that they go, wait, what? Explain that part again, and actually want to hear the answer. So as I say in my book, when I talk about confession, including with my friends, they go, oh, you go to confession, what's that like? I don't go, well, there's a box and a priest, that part's not very interesting. I go, well, confession. It's rather like Japanese pottery repair, isn't it? And that's a first sentence where people go, what? And they do honestly want to hear the next answer, because the next thing doesn't sound like it's going to be because Catholicism is true and you're wrong, right? It sounds like it's going to be open-ended and weird, and they'd like to at least know what I was about to say. I say, yes, it's rather like Japanese pottery repair. Because did you know that there's this kind of pottery repair called kintsugi, which is different than just kind of putting together a pot so that looks like it was never broken. What you do is you mix the enamel that you're using to bind all the pieces together with gold, so that you can see every single crack in the pot, but they're all veined with gold, something even more precious than the original vase. And that's what confession is like. It's not a question of being made unbroken. It's a question of being healed, and not kind of in a gross surgical way, but in this kintsugi way, where the marks of healing are precious to us. And then at least I've said something, my friend hasn't heard before. And I've said something that wasn't, oh, confession, you should probably go, you've sinned a bunch, But it's welcoming, it's something that kind of naturally invites questions. And that's really where I want to be in a disagreement of, setting out a hospitable place for my friend to ask questions more than for me to say things. Because I don't know everything that's relevant to say to my friend when we disagree. Even for some friends who I've known, for like 6 or 7 years, so I feel like I know exactly in what ways they're wrong and why. And maybe I could write an entire paper about, well, here's everything I know about you, and I know you so well, and we've had all these conversations. I wrote this 30-page paper, and here you go. When you read it, you'll agree with me. And those are the people I know. Like, the people I don't know well already, I can't even write the 30-page paper, but it's still likely that along the way, they'll be reading and go, this part's not true. This isn't true about me, this part doesn't make sense, and we'll the disagreement will fade out. I don't want to have my disagreements on rails where I'm waiting for someone to give, the next little response that's a very short response so I can keep going with my speech. I want there to be a lot of room for questions, and for me to be surprised, and for me to say, oh, wow, I've not heard someone ask me that question before. It wasn't something I thought about when becoming Catholic. I don't know. I had different problems when I was becoming Catholic. Here's an interesting Dominican priest I know who I could talk to for you, or you could talk to for you. I could meet you again at your house, and you could make dinner this time, and I'll look up some stuff and see what I can find. But it should feel natural for there to be pauses for both of us, and just breathing space in our disagreement where we hear things we don't know already and get to learn something. And that's one thing I have enjoyed about having disagreements about religion or anything else. Often, when I'm having them kind of slowly and peacefully and hospitably enough for the other person to actually ask me questions, I get the chance to learn something more about my own faith, and then to get to go back and share it out again. I get the chance to explore something that is interesting, because there's a different kind of question you get in a slow, peaceful, loving disagreement than an argument. Right? In an argument, someone's just trying to get you to ask a question that goes, that part was wrong, right? And you're like, well, maybe, well, then you're entirely wrong. Those aren't interesting questions. But if someone goes, oh, you said that thing about kintsugi and the pottery and confession, well, in what way do you hold on to those marks? You just said, the pot is marked. You don't look different when you came out of confession. What does that mean? And I might kind of go, okay, yeah, I think the metaphor makes sense at a level. Does it make sense at this level? Am I marked in some way? And I think I'm often marked by memory then, that for me, those kind of veins of gold repair are remembering what I've done, but having that memory of sin now be completely intermingled with the memory of being forgiven, that it changes the character of the memory, that it's no longer just the, oh man, I should not have done that, but it's mingled with love in the same way that that empty space is now filled with gold. But that's a thought I wouldn't have had next if I hadn't had space in a conversation for someone to ask me another question. So whenever I find myself having a disagreement where I notice I get to keep talking forever, I've started to learn that that doesn't mean the other person is agreeing with me the whole time, but that they're outweighting me, and that incidentally I am learning nothing. Maybe this conversation is good for my friend, maybe. It's certainly not doing anything for me. So I want the opportunity to be taught whether because someone points out something I have wrong, or even just talk through questions that kind of turn my eyes back on what I'm proposing and get to see it afresh and anew. And that's really, I think, the other thing that's an opportunity. I framed this as a discussion about sharing your faith in a secular world with the idea that you're not sharing assumptions with the person you're disagreeing with. I frequently find myself not sharing assumptions with all Catholics. So I like having the opportunity to see part of the Catholic faith refracted back at me through someone else's eyes. Here's this prayer practice I've done. Here's where I've struggled with it. What have you learned? Here's St. Catherine of Siena, who I find terrifying. I read the Sigrid Undset biography of her, which is wonderful, but very frightening. And then I turn to a friend and go, wow, you love this biography. Tell me more about why. So kind of looking at every disagreement, not as a disagreement, and a quest for mastery. So who's going to win? But what will I learn? Because I have that opportunity when I have a major disagreement, when I have a minor disagreement, or even in conversations that don't start and don't turn into disagreements at all. That just seeing the world through someone else's eyes expands my own vision. And part of what I like about the diversity of the saints is what we see there is God's glory and light reflected through all these different people, and it looks different in each one. G.K. Chesterton says you have like the very martial saints like Joan of Arc and the pacifist saints, and what they all are is maybe one virtue personified. And you get a sense of what God is by looking at all these tiny distillations of what goodness looks like as reflected in one small life. And when I have a disagreement, when I make space for someone to disagree with me, I'm making space for them to show me how to look through their own eyes, which is a big ask, which is asking them to be vulnerable and to expose themselves to me, which is something they can only do in the home of a friend. But when I get to do that, I get to look out at the world through another perspective and see different parts of what the world is and what God is, just by getting to see how this person experiences the world, which is an enormous gift. And I'm lucky enough that most of the time I can buy that solely with patience and with cookies. So I'd like to encourage you all, when you find yourself in a disagreement, to ask, how can I be hospitable? How can I be hospitable just in the location that we're having this? Can I move this disagreement somewhere else? Can I have it at my own home? Can I show someone that I'm welcoming them before we even get up to the first thing I really want to say to them? How can I be hospitable in the way I conduct my argument? How can I welcome them to admit doubt? To admit, oh, that was a good point, and am I exhibiting those virtues myself? Because if you never say, oh, that's a good point, it's probably not because your opponent has said nothing smart in the whole disagreement. It's probably because your whole disagreement feels like neither of you can give any ground. It would be unsafe. And then your friend can't wind up conceding. And then finally, when I finally get to the point where we're actually having the disagreement, when I show my position to my friend, am I showing that whatever I think will kind of beat them up the most, kind of like proof, and then you concede? Or am I showing them whatever delights me most, or whatever I think will intrigue them, so that they're invited to keep coming back to me and to continue this conversation and to continue this friendship? And am I kind of hungry not just to show them what I have, whatever beautiful truth it is I think they should look at, but hungry to look at it as they're looking at it and to see through their eyes and to love them and to get the gift, if I'm brave enough to ask for it, of not just looking at my own argument through their eyes, but getting to look at the whole world through their eyes and be surprised by what else there is to delight in that my own blind spots hide from me. Thank you.